Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Toast and Topics.
It's good to be back, Ben.
That's right, and today we're talking about foreign aid. As you all know, there has been a lot happening in this space. First, American aid to foreign countries has really shrunk dramatically in the past 3 months. In fact, the Trump administration essentially froze all foreign aid in January, slashing 90% of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID for short, and it cut around 60 billion in global aid funding as part of a 90-day review of aid programs. And so in this episode, we're going to focus on a few things. First, we're going to discuss the magnitude of foreign aid cuts across developed nations, including the United States. Then we'll highlight some of the benefits and deficiencies of foreign aid. And finally, we'll conclude with some thoughts on how foreign aid can potentially be channeled more effectively.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's jump right in. The destruction of USAID has been all over the news. One day, USAID's website was even taken offline, and thousands of aid contracts were canceled almost immediately. And this is a huge deal because the United States provides a big chunk of the world's aid. Nearly 29% of all aid from OECD countries in 2023, for example, came from the US. So when American funding dries up, it sends shockwaves through humanitarian programs virtually everywhere.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Sachin, it's not just the US pulling back. Other countries have been cutting their aid programs as well. The United Kingdom, just as one example, just announced a major rollback of its aid budget. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is reducing the UK's foreign aid from about 0.5% of UK national income to around 0.3% of UK national income, and that's a cut of around 6 billion pounds. It actually was such a drastic cut that the UK's development minister resigned in protest.
And it's a similar story elsewhere in Europe as well. Several donors had already been tightening their belts on aid. France, as an example, slashed its aid budget by 35% recently, and countries like Belgium have trimmed theirs by almost 25%. Even the Netherlands has laid out plans to dial back aid in the coming years. So we're really seeing this broad trend of Western countries retreating from their foreign aid commitments. And I think there's a few reasons why the foreign aid pie has shrunk, so to speak, in developed countries. The first is demographics. And I know we've talked about this before, Ben, but in many developed countries, fiscal deficits are getting far too wide. And as societies age, more cash will be needed for pensions and healthcare. And many countries, especially those in East Asia and now even the US, are starting to realize that budgets will inevitably have to be rebalanced in some way. The second is defense. Today's world is obviously more uncertain than in recent history, and more money has to be set aside for security. For example, to support Ukraine's defense, members of the European Union will need to double their defense budget, which is an increase of more than 300 billion euros a year.
That's interesting, and I can definitely see those fiscal obligations squeezing out some amount of aid, even if aid makes up a fairly small portion of government budgets around the world. It seems very clear, at the very least, that aid budgets are shrinking across the board, but it is also worth noting that that is not automatically an entirely bad thing. And that brings us to the next part of our discussion on what the pros and cons of these foreign aid programs might be.
Exactly. And it may sound counterintuitive, but some experts say that less aid isn't always necessarily a bad thing. And the reason for this is because decades of massive foreign aid hasn't necessarily transformed the institutions or governance in the way that the providers of that aid had hoped. In some cases, huge aid flows can actually foster some forms of dependency instead of real development.
Yeah, it's a good point. And a prime example of that is Afghanistan, which I spent a lot of time studying when I was a college undergrad. The US and other countries poured literally hundreds of billions of dollars of aid into Afghanistan during America's 20-year military involvement in that country. But that didn't lead to a self-sustaining Afghan government or to a strong economy. At one point, 75% of the Afghan government's budget was coming from foreign aid. Aid even made up an estimated 40% of Afghanistan's GDP. The level of dependence was really incredible.
Wow, that's pretty staggering. And that level of dependency obviously had consequences. You know, when a government is so dependent on foreign aid, its leaders often end up more accountable to donors rather than their own people. And in Afghanistan, officials spent a lot of time trying to keep international donors happy rather than focusing on their own citizens' needs.
Right. And because donors were really quite eager to see quick results, they could often, unfortunately, bypass the government entirely. In fact, about two-thirds of foreign aid to Afghanistan never even went through the government's hands. Instead, aid agencies and contractors ran a lot of those programs themselves. And that might have gotten schools or clinics built faster, but it also undercut the Afghan government's ability to build its own capacity. Afghan ministries weren't managing those projects or funds, and so they weren't developing the skills and institutions, and most importantly, relationships with their own citizens to deliver services on their own.
Yeah, that's well said. So you had the situation where basic services and salaries depended on external funding. But when that funding slowed, the government couldn't really step up because it never had the chance to really grow stronger. And in the long run, all that aid didn't really fix the underlying issues. Corruption remained high, and institutions were fairly weak. And we saw that when foreign troops withdrew, the government rapidly collapsed.
That's right. And I think the broader point that is coming from this is that more aid doesn't automatically equal better governance. In fact, at times it can hinder it. If a country's leaders don't have to rely on local tax revenue because foreign aid is footing their bills, they might not develop a responsive, effective government. There's less incentive to reform or deliver better results to citizens. And in Afghanistan's case, truly vast aid programs were thus not able to ensure lasting stability or development.
Yeah, so in that sense, a reduction in aid might force some governments to become more self-reliant and accountable. It's a controversial idea, but it's worth considering. Cutting off aid can push leaders, in theory, to mobilize their own resources, fight corruption, and actually respond to their people's needs, which are things that could possibly be ignored if donors are always covering the cost. So that's really the upside argument for why less aid isn't necessarily the end of the world, at least through the lens of building stronger institutions. But there's another side to this.
Yeah, but, and this is a very big but, even if aid hasn't turned around governance in places like Afghanistan, it has done tremendous good on a human level. And that brings us to the flip side of this discussion, why aid is still really very important.
Yeah, and just to get to the point here, aid undeniably saves lives and improves livelihoods when channeled to the right things. There are real people benefiting from these programs every day in foreign countries. And so let's spend some time talking about what's at stake when aid actually gets slashed.
Yeah, a huge and now jeopardized success story is in global health. Take PEPFAR, for example, the US government's HIV/AIDS relief program. PEPFAR has been an absolute game changer in fighting AIDS over the past 20 years. As of 2023, it was providing life-saving HIV treatment to over 20 million people worldwide. And by doing that, it's estimated to be saving more than 1 million lives each year from HIV/AIDS. If funding for PEPFAR is cut or not renewed, all of those people's lives are at risk. They could lose access to essential medications. In fact, PEPFAR's future recently came into question, and it was only extended short term amid some pretty heavy political wrangling, which has many aid experts very worried.
And PEPFAR is just one program. U.S. foreign aid also supports efforts to fight malaria, tuberculosis, polio, and other diseases. For example, a major anti-malaria partnership, which is known as the RBM Partnership to End Malaria, used to get about half of its budget from the US, which was suddenly terminated this year. Losing that money means fewer bed nets, fewer malaria medications, and potentially more deaths from malaria. And these health programs are literally lifelines for many people. They don't necessarily strengthen a government structure, but they keep people alive and healthy on the ground. And we call this positive externalities in economic jargon.
Yeah. And even more than that, there's just basic humanitarian aid, things like food assistance, clean water, and disaster relief. When the US froze its aid, a lot of these critical services came to a halt. And this is not an abstract thing. This has immediate effects. I was reading about an aid group in Somalia that had to close the only health clinics that it had across several communities because their US funding was yanked. They also had to stop a nutrition program in Somalia that was feeding 1,700 malnourished children every day. If you cut off food deliveries or shut down health centers, children and families in crisis zones have nowhere else to turn.
That's heartbreaking. And it's not just direct aid, but also the systems that support aid that are important to maintain. With reduced aid budgets, even our ability to detect crises is affected. The US used to fund something called the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, known as FuseNet, which for decades has been the eyes and ears monitoring food security around the world. And that program as well was abruptly shut down after nearly 40 years due to budget cuts. And experts are terrified that without this program, we might not see a famine coming until it's too late. One food security professor noted that FuseNet was the main tool for the US to decide where to send its food aid. And without this eyes and ears system, it's really hard to know how to allocate emergency food assistance now.
The same goes for vaccinations, clean water projects, education for kids in war zones, and more. All of these provide immediate, tangible benefits to people. And even if they don't fix a country's politics overnight, they do prevent human suffering.
There's also a longer term strategic cost to gutting aid. If the US and other countries step back completely, it does leave a void, and that void can be filled by chaos, like we talked about, more disease outbreaks, more hunger, and more people displaced by crises. But it could be also filled by other powers. And we've seen already that countries like China are increasing their influence strategically in places where Western aid is slowly retreating. And so cutting aid can undermine global health and weaken a country's soft power and security interests. There's reports that American retreat from aid could potentially cede ground to other countries like China who are eager to step in.
All of this begs the question of what we can be doing differently to make aid more effectively spent and to create the biggest positive impacts that we can in developing countries. And there are a few things to keep in mind here. Number one, we, of course, ought to be spending on things that matter. It's going to be important to be focusing on the programs that might, like health spending, have very large positive externalities. That's an economist term that means large positive second order benefits, such as the higher productivity that you might get to having a healthier population in the case of health spending. Number two, we should consider acting in areas where governments have special coordinating power. For aid that is the most life-saving, agencies like those in the United Nations have the proper security apparatus to reach disaster or conflict zones, and this would ensure that aid is getting funneled to the areas that need it the most. Third, we ought to get involved if there is information the public will struggle to assess where we may actually have a comparative advantage. Some examples of this could be how to adapt to climate change or how to evaluate the risks of a new pandemic where aid agencies might have the technological prowess to be able to detect and analyze things faster and more accurately than local governments might.
Those are all good points, Ben. And so to conclude this podcast, the bottom line is that while aid might not reform a government overnight, it still matters immensely for people's daily lives. And completely pulling the plug on US aid programs would mean losing a lot of very valuable things like malaria clinics, food for refugees, clean water projects, HIV treatments, you name it. These are things that, if removed, have an immediate human cost. And the challenge moving forward is finding the right balance. So we need to recognize aid's limitations. It by no means is a cure for governments and all of their governance problems. Reforms really do have to come from within. But at the same time, we shouldn't dismiss the very real good that smart aid programs do. Ideally, donors will reform how aid is given to avoid creating dependency or corruption while still maintaining life-saving assistance for those who need it most.
It's a tough balance, and it's something that policymakers will be grappling with over the coming months as they deal with the ramifications of these aid cuts. One thing I think is clear. If aid stays completely frozen, much of the progress made in global health and poverty alleviation could unravel quickly.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that, and that maybe we can take this moment to improve aid as well, not just cut it.
Yep, that's right. We've seen over the course of this episode's deep dive why aid budgets are shrinking, why some say that's not all bad, and certainly why we still need many of these aid programs just to keep people alive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time where we will continue this conversation by talking to one of Sachin's good friends, Nikhil Kamdar, who is a current med school student that just returned from a service trip to Uganda. He'll share more about his experience on the ground there, including how foreign aid has positively benefited communities and where it would be best channeled. We'll catch you then. Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.